Hi, folks. This is Don Meisner with the North Country Fishing Report. Well, in other reports, I've talked about soft plastics and how well they work. But I got thinking, there's so many different types of soft plastics. And there's a couple things that make all the difference in the world how well a soft plastic works. Number one is how soft or hard the plastic is. The softer the plastic is, the more alive it's going to look in the water. The more subject it is to being worn out, but the more alive it looks. But also the type of tail. The tail is everything. And if you want a fish to wiggle and wobble and look like a fish kind of swimming, then a paddle tail. The paddle creates resistance in the water and it will flop back and forth. And so if you're choosing a soft plastic that has a paddle tail, it's going to swim kind of like a fish. All you got to do is reel it, and the motion against the water will cause that tail to wiggle. And a paddle tail is pretty easy to spot when you're looking for the type of soft plastics. Then there's soft plastic, and this goes way back when they first brought them to market, that have a curly tail. In other words, it might have a fat body up where the head's supposed to be, and then they'll taper down to a tail that curves around like a coil. So when you pull that through the water, that curly tail really almost like spins in the water, creates a lot of motion. Doesn't look like a fish swimming as much as it looks like something that's creating a lot of motion. And they were extremely popular years ago. That's where the original plastic, Mr. Twister, came from, that design. And then there's plastic baits that start with sort of a thick body and they taper down to almost like a pointed, little thin, skinny tail. And these plastics will act differently in the water. You got to make them do something. But what they can do is dart from side to side very naturally when you start moving the rod tip. And one of the sport names for these baits is called a fluke. But there's lots of variations. These do not develop as much action on their own. So if you want to just reel them, they're going to be very, very subtle. But remember, there's a lot of reasons why fish will strike a bait. Either it looks like something they want to eat, they're hungry, and they're striking it to feed. Another reason they will strike is out of reaction. So something that goes by them and flashes or wiggles or does something can pique their interest, their curiosity, and they'll strike for that reason, or it piques their anger. And finally, if fish are actively feeding, if they're going after bait, then a bait like what I told you about, the fluke with a skinny tail that doesn't have a lot of motion on its own, but it will swim probably more naturally, more lifelike as it goes through the water with hardly a motion, because fish don't waste a lot of motion. They can swim very, very smoothly and fast. So in a case like that, this type of tail makes a difference. And finally, one other thing that you should be aware of is the type of jig head or lack of jig head you use to fish them makes a difference. The shape of the jig head has to match kind of the design and shape of the plastic, and you'll get the best action. The heavier the jig head, the quicker it's going to sink down in the water, and it's going to make that plastic look differently. And finally, if you use no weight, if you want to be able to work that bait across the surface, then you just use a single hook and rig it, probably Texas style would be the best. And sometimes that can be deadly. Until next time, folks, this is Don Meisner with the North Country Fishing Report.